In 1969, the surgeon Robin Cook was drafted to work with the US Navy on their Sea Lab program. He served on Navy submarines, and one day, while stationed at San Diego, he met a fellow doctor doing postdoctoral work at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies by the name of Michael Crichton. Crichton was becoming disenchanted with the field of medicine and planned to leave it behind to pursue a career as a writer following the enormous success of his novel, The Andromeda Strain. The two doctors formed an immediate friendship, and perhaps inspired by Crichton, Robin Cook began to write a novel while serving on the USS Kamehameha called The Year of the Intern. Dealing with the stress and strain of medical internships, the novel was a critical and commercial failure when it was published in 1973. Cook never stopped practicing medicine, but he was determined not to let the book's failure deter him from a side career as a novelist. He spent some time studying the formulas of various bestsellers, including Jaws, 7 Days in May, and the spy thrillers of Eric Ambler, and he came up with a series of index cards containing techniques used by successful writers to manipulate an audience. Then, in 1975, Cook used each and every one of these index cards to create his second novel, Coma, published in 1977. This would become a massive hit, and is often credited with popularizing, if not outright inventing, the entire subgenre of the medical thriller. Hollywood took notice before the book was even published, and it was then up to none other than Cook's friend, Michael Crichton, to figure out how to put Robin Cook's seminal novel on the silver screen. Something is not quite right at the Boston Memorial Hospital. A handful of patients have gone in for routine surgical procedures only to come out brain dead and comatose. When one of these unfortunate souls happens to be the friend of one of the hospital's surgical residents, Dr. Susan Wheeler starts digging into the records in search of answers. Following a sparse trail of breadcrumbs and dissuaded by both her boyfriend and her superiors, she finds a mysterious organization called the Jefferson Institute, where a terrible secret waits to be discovered. Before we go any further, if you could please hit that like button, together we might expose this conspiracy once and for all. If you really do like this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button as well. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. After the success of 1973's Westworld, MGM was eager to give Michael Crichton another chance in the director's chair. However, Crichton was mentally exhausted from his filmmaking experience and took a year off to recuperate. He did eventually go back to MGM and tried to get another project or two off the ground, but they never quite came together. That was until Coma came along. Though he had never worked on anything he didn't write himself, Coma was similar in style to his own work and dealt with the practice of medicine, which he had been trained in. He therefore found it relatively easy to adapt his friend's novel into a screenplay, with his biggest hurdle being an argument with the studio over the main character. The novel has a female protagonist, but the studio wanted to swap the gender and have it be a male, perhaps a role suited for someone like Paul Newman. Crichton balked at this, noting not only that the story's tone draws heavily from the character's gender, but also that modern cinema has a poor track record of telling stories about female accomplishments. He did compromise by toning down the feminist overtones of Cook's story. In the novel, the main character is a feminist activist, but the subtext is still absolutely apparent in the final script.
Honey, I'm gonna take a shower. Could you grab me a beer before you start dinner?
Hey, Mark, get your own beer.
Aside from that fight, which Crichton thankfully won, his other big concern in adapting the novel was that he didn't want to scare people away from hospitals and surgeons, much as Steven Spielberg's Jaws had scared people away from the beach. He knew that nearly all of us need surgery at some point in our lives, and he didn't want to exaggerate the fears that most people naturally have about it. The producer, Marty Ehrlichman, on the other hand, knew that the story's reliance on medical anxiety was a potential selling point that would ensure a good box office performance. To play the lead, the young surgical resident Dr. Susan Wheeler, Crichton wanted Geneviève Bujold, a French-Canadian actress known for Earthquake, Obsession, and above all her award-winning turn as Anne Boleyn in Anne of the Thousand Days. beating out the likes of Farrah Fawcett and Julie Christie, Bajol was initially hesitant to take the part, but Crichton was able to cajole her after she read the script. Her character's love interest, the fellow resident Dr. Mark Bellows, is played by Michael Douglas, who was already a hot commodity in Hollywood after his run on the television show The Streets of San Francisco and his production of the critical smash hit One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Though he'd been nominated for a Golden Globe nearly a decade earlier for his performance in Hail Hero, Coma would be his first major success as an actor, launching an impressive career that is still going strong over 40 years later. The main antagonist of the film, Dr. Harris, is played by veteran actor Richard Widmark, who'd been in dozens of great films like Kiss of Death, No Way Out, and 1974's Murder on the Orient Express. Also worth noting are Elizabeth Astley as the even slimier Nurse Emerson, Rip Torn as Dr. George, the chief of anesthesiology, future Bond girl Lois Chiles as the ill-fated Nancy Greenlee, a young Ed Harris in his feature film debut as this creepy pathology resident, and Tom Selleck as another ill-fated surgery patient. Selleck reportedly only got the role because of his appearances on billboards for Salem cigarettes. Filming on Coma began in late June of 1977 on a budget of $4.5 million. A little over a week of location shooting was done in and around Boston, Massachusetts, in places like Boston City Hospital and Crane Beach. A key location was the exterior of the Xerox regional headquarters in Lexington, now the head office of StrideRite, which doubled for the fictional Jefferson Institute. More location shooting was done back in Southern California at the USC Medical School and an air conditioning plant in Century City. For the iconic Jefferson Institute interior involving the coma patients surrounded by wires, which was filmed on a soundstage at the MGM lot that Crichton kept under strict security, extras were hired to hold a rigid pose in what proved to be a physically demanding job that could only be performed in 6-minute intervals. 2 versions of each scene were filmed, one with the actors partially nude for the film release, and one in which they were covered up to be safe for television. The music was put together by Jerry Goldsmith, who had worked with Crichton before on the TV movie Pursuit and would work with him again on The Great Train Robbery and Runaway, not to mention the scores he would make for other movies based on Crichton's novels. Goldsmith's score for Coma is tense but understated, relying on frantic string arrangements, low woodwinds, and discordant piano cues to convey anxiety without blaring over the film with brass and percussion. It's also important to note that the film has no score whatsoever until the 45-minute mark. I find myself talking about Goldsmith a lot on this channel, but he is truly excellent at matching his music to the style of the film, and while the score for Coma doesn't have too much in the way of recognizable themes or motifs, it goes a long way to carrying the movie. Coma released in January of 1978 to relatively good reviews and even better box office success. It grossed somewhere between $30 and $50 million and would prove to be Michael Crichton's biggest hit as a director. While it hasn't had the enormous pop culture footprint of Westworld, the image of half-naked comatose bodies hanging on wires has remained in the zeitgeist. For me, I have to say I love this movie and feel like it doesn't get enough credit. Sure, from a filmmaking standpoint, it's a pretty standard thriller with a few sequences of late 70s cheese that you'd expect to find in a made-for-TV movie, but I don't think it was anybody's intention to reinvent the wheel here. I can understand why it was Crichton's best-performing directorial effort, because it is a far better match for his stylistic choices than Westworld, which hasn't aged nearly as well. The film does a remarkable job grounding itself in reality, allowing the doctors and nurses to speak in authentic medical jargon without dumbing it down too much for audiences. It also perfectly captures the mundanity of real-life operating rooms, the way doctors and nurses idly chat away while prepping a patient for surgery. And that's what this film is really about, the depersonalization of the patient, the way modern medicine seems to treat people as meat rather than human beings. Both Robin Cook and Michael Crichton were critics of this aspect of their chosen profession, but Coma goes out of its way to demonstrate how that happens without getting carried away by political speechifying or overly sensationalized melodrama. Instead, it's all very prosaic. The camera doesn't linger on the grisly business of people dissecting human bodies for parts, but it does hang on people making phone calls to adjust the price indexes of organs, or a nurse talking about her kid while putting an anesthetized woman's legs in stirrups for a therapeutic abortion. This is where the true horror of the story lies, and Crichton was wise to keep his focus on it rather than the more macabre visual details. When Dr. Wheeler begins to unravel the conspiracy, the story is told in such a way that it would be really easy to believe she is simply unraveling her own sanity, that she is finding a way to rationalize the apparently meaningless and random death of a friend while trying to cope with the stress of a strained romantic relationship. Indeed, if you put yourself in the shoes of her boyfriend, you might find yourself realizing you would probably treat her the same way. Bujold's performance is thus absolutely mesmerizing, with her determination, fragility, and uncertainty all coming across brilliantly, often all at the same time. Perhaps this is why Coma has aged so well. Its core ideas are perhaps even more relevant today, and most of us, I dare say, have an underlying paranoia about modern medicine and its corporate/bureaucratic incentives, especially in the United States. Even at the film's most ridiculous moments, and even though some of the medical details are inaccurate by modern scientific understanding, it is still frighteningly believable every step of the way. What's worse is that when Dr. Harris gives his villain's monologue to a drugged Dr. Wheeler explaining the moral ambiguity of his perspective, you can almost see his point. Almost.
No decision is easy, Sue. It only looks that way when you're young.
And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What's your favorite medical thriller? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what I do even more, consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future video topics, and more. You can also check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more sci-fi classics in both film and literature. Until next time, though, when we'll find out if there's anything artificial underneath the perfect suburban housewife, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
I guess I have an overactive imagination.
You should be like me. Everybody says I have no imagination at all.
Oh.